Hi, good morning, everyone. Very excited to be here. Thanks so much all for joining us today. Um, if you hear any noise in the background, my dog just did wake up from a nap, so I apologize. And if it's distracting, just put something in the chat and I can throw another room. Um, but yeah, basically my background, as Adam mentioned, is primarily in film and video and working with archival material in that setting. I got my start working in post-production, editing, organizing media assets in like industry settings, and then kind of found my way into digitization working at a vendor when I lived in Chicago. And much of my training when I was in my undergrad at CalArts was focused on analog video art and media technologies. So kind of just all came together over time, as it happens for a lot of people in this field, where you just kind of fall into it. And eventually ended up going to UIUC to get my LIS degree so that I could focus more in working in archives and kind of left the media industry setting. So with that said, this is going to be it's going to be as comprehensive as kind of an introductory slideshow can be to moving images and the different qualities that they have, the different conservational issues that we're going to be dealing with. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it. And if you have any questions, go ahead and write them down and save it to the end. I feel like there's probably a lot more I could have covered, but I'm trying to spare you all and kind of not overload you with information. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So essentially, what is media preservation? As you probably already know, as film and video ages, it becomes susceptible to deterioration and ultimately permanent loss. This is something that is very unique to the AV or media archival field. As you stray away from paper and books, we're seeing that this media is does unfortunately not fall within the archival and conservational precedents that have been set for the last however many decades, because these actually can be gone in a matter of 5 to 10 years in their worst condition. So media preservationists and archives like Texas Archive, we seek to remedy this issue essentially by trying to digitize as much content as we can. And that's primarily what we're focused on. I know that there's kind of a debate about conservation and preservation and how you use those terms. I might use them interchangeably because I consider digitization to be a part of the preservation process, considering the fact that, again, much of this stuff could easily not exist in a year from now. So this is an example here on the right-hand side of the lab that we're working with at TAMI. We can handle a variety of formats, both broadcast and consumer. And by broadcast and consumer is something like VHS. Broadcast would be something like a Betacam tape, if you have ever encountered one of those in your work. And we can record up to 6 videos at one time. So that expediency allows us to kind of get up to maybe like 40 different items digitized in one day. And we are still at a backlog despite that, because we have thousands of items waiting and sitting in our queue from various news collections that we have, as well as our Texas Film Roundup, which is where we collect materials from home movie materials, primarily from people all across Texas. So we're kind of working against the clock, but trying to work as fast as we can. And then a little more time-based media is just basically anything that has a time-based component. And so we'll be looking specifically at film, video, and some digital files. We won't get too heavy into it, but hopefully we'll cover a few things we don't already know. So this is the basic rough timeline of media formats. We see film emerge in the 1890s. We see video emerge in the 1950s. DVDs kind of pop in the 90s. And then we have digital video from the 1990s to present. This is kind of, again, just kind of a rough overview here, to give us a sense of what we're working with, and also to give us a sense of, again, like how new this field is and how new these medias are. Because we're, not even 2 centuries deep yet, which is so unique. So there's a big kind of, as you all might know as archivists, there's a big devaluation of time-based media in our field, particularly when you're trying to get grants or you're trying to speak to donors or board members about like why this should be funded, because there's kind of this idea that it's pop culture, that it's newer, and so therefore, let's focus our attention and funding on paper and rare books and all this. Not that that's not warranted, but the thing is again, with it deteriorating in real time, there's kind of a big need for us to kind of push the idea that this is primary source documentation that's worthy of being preserved before it's gone forever. And in our present day media landscape, we also have this big advantage where we can put things on social media and actually kind of participate in that democratization of knowledge and make things accessible. So Texas Archive, for example, we have a TikTok that has about close to 60,000 followers. This is just an example post here of some KPRC footage. That's a news station in Houston. We have footage from their 1966 broadcast of a NASA event. So, things like that, where we have a lot of flexibility in how we can share these archival materials so they don't just sit after we digitize them. And so again, cannot stress enough the sense of urgency. In our best estimates, the Library of Congress, for example, thinks that we've lost over 70% of early silent films that were created in the US. As you can imagine, that's a significant amount. A lot of these films also being what were called pre-code films, so films before there was like a regulatory board of like what social norms and morals and standards could be shown in film, were a big part of that. So we've lost kind of like a big part of American culture and pop culture, if you think about it in that way as well. Things like DVDs can range from 5 to 10 years in terms of their lifespan. Film can range up to 100 years, and I'm using a conservative estimate on that, and that's dependent on humidity, temperature, and light exposure. Some archives and vaults will say that we have more than 100 years for film because it is stable, and if you have it in cold storage, it will last. But there was a chemist recently that did test films under ideal quote unquote conditions and found that they still were decaying at a like molecular level in the vault, even in cold storage, and all the ideal humidity and temperature and et cetera conditions. So, and I've listed that. It's by Ida Ahmad. It's called Historical Films May Be Decaying Much Faster Than We Thought. And you can read that there. And I know we'll also be sharing out this this recording later in case you don't have time to kind of write it down. So we are going to get into film preservation now. So again, history of time-based media, we're looking at the 1890s. One of the earliest examples was the Lumiere brothers. Definitely recommend looking into their work. And all they started with was a camera or the cinematography, which was a camera, projector, and a printer all in one. So we've come a long way. And as an example of some of the earliest footage that worked in that, we didn't even like the Edison company, this panorama of East Galveston, which is the oldest moving picture that at least we have, at least at TAMI. We don't have like the physical copy, but we have a facsimile. This is one of the oldest moving pictures of Texas. And this, for example, was not even shot on like proper celluloid film that you think of today. And by celluloid, I mean like an 8mm Super 8 film that's based on like, you know, plastic acetate or polyester film. It was literally like, you know, we're looking at photographic stills that were put together through a very different apparatus than what we think of today. So, and again, we see film rise from being, we see film rise into what we more so recognize today. For example, like 16mm film rises as a medium for historical documentation. A great example of this are Zora Neale Hurston's films, where she made a lot of documentaries for her anthropological research. And they, you know, are still preserved today, can be found online. Some have been lost, but the majority, I would say, more or less are preserved. And so we start to see 16mm film really rise as something, you know, something that people are using to capture history as it unfolds right in front of us. And so just kind of reiterating that, the 16mm film rises also as a format, a media format that's primarily used for news stations. So we see here some footage of the Riverside National Bank, which was the first Black-owned bank in Houston. This footage is from 1963. And we see here a great example of one of the most common uses for 16mm film in the 50s and 60s, and honestly, even into the 80s. There were a lot of documentary films still being shot on 16mm. So it's one of the formats that I want to stress the most, because as you are working in archives and preservation, more likely than not, if you find 16mm footage, there's probably something really important on there, something very unique. And I always encourage people, do not discard your film, don't get intimidated by it. There's a solution for everything. There's always going to be a way to extract that, whether it's by digitization or just preserving it until you have the funds for that. But again, I cannot stress 16mm film is such a vital media format when we're looking at time-based media and the historical content it might hold. 8mm and Super 8, which we'll get into, which are the smaller gauges you see at the bottom, more so were home movie footage, which again is a historical primary document in and of itself. But if you find 16 or even Super 16, which is the format below it, you're most likely going to be dealing with some very unique news footage or some independent documentary. Because again, that opening of Riverside Bank footage is something from our KPRC collection, and it was previously just an unseen spool of films that had broadcast once on the air in the 1960s and then had sat in storage until TAMI digitized it. So again, you can be finding, you might find some really unique things in your collection that do not exist anywhere or online when you have 16 in your possession. So the formats we'll be looking at today are 16, 8mm, and Super 8. So as far as 8mm, this was and is a consumer film format. You might find some filmmakers that are more auteurs or experimental that shot on 8mm, Super 8. You'll also find a lot of like short films, particularly like student films that'll be shot on Super 8. So if you work at a university and you have some Super 8 in your possession in the university archives, definitely might be taking a look there. You might have some old Richard Linklater student films, who knows? This format is introduced by Kodak in 1932. And Super 8 emerges in 1965, and Super 8's just a variation of the 8mm. Some of the preservational concerns that we see with both formats are vinegar syndrome, mold, and brittleness. So vinegar syndrome, if you haven't previously encountered it, it literally is when the film smells like vinegar. Not to get too deep into the chemistry of film, but 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter film was acetate based. We do have polyester film, but acetate film, when it off gases, releases the same chemical compound, acetic acid, that vinegar is based on. So if you're working in an archive or lab, or if you're just doing a preservation assessment on site, if someone says I have films and you go to check it out and you smell a vinegar smell, that means that that film is in a state of decomposition and it needs attention pretty immediately. The other thing to keep in mind too is that there is a general sense in our field that vinegar syndrome, it's not going to like harm you, but keep in mind if you are working day in and day out, or have interns or grad students that are working with films affected by vinegar syndrome, that acetic acid over time can actually irritate your eyes, it can irritate your hands. So just make sure if you're working with a high volume of this for several hours that you are wearing goggles, you're wearing gloves, and you're taking a lot of breaks to breathe in some fresh air to not irritate your lungs. These films do need to be quarantined because that acetic acid off-gassing can spread to other films that are around it. So we always recommend having like an isolated area where you can put these films away from, also keep them away from paper materials if you're going to do that isolation, because that acetic acid can also, as you know, acid and paper don't go together, so it can also degrade and decompose any paper that's around it. So if you can, just find an isolated closet or shelf space or something to put any films that you encounter that might be affected by this. Mold, kind of an obvious one that we face with paper and film. And then brittleness. So the picture here is an example of 16 millimeter film from the 1930s. And as you can see, it's extremely brittle. This film was in such a bad state of decomposition that if you touch it, you can easily crack those sprockets that are on either side of it, and it could potentially break. So be really careful when you're working with films that are older, that you're handling them super gently, because again, if it is a very unique item, you can send it out to a lab for some sort of remediation. Yeah, just one thing to keep in mind as you work with these formats. Oh, sorry, if you heard my dog barking. So as far as preservational concerns, another thing you can encounter is shrinkage. So when a film is kept in a metal can, there's something called shrinkage that occurs when the acetic acid is actually eating away at the film itself. This is also where you're going to find some brittleness there, where the film is going to need extra preservational attention. And when you find a film that's in this state of decomposition, I wouldn't recommend attempting to handle it yourself unless you already have some solid film handling skills, because I've definitely had instances where I've had interns begin to handle these films and they start cracking in their hands. And luckily, you'll see it pretty immediately within the first, even couple of feet of the film. But it's something to kind of put aside, quarantine, and come up with a preservation plan for it. And we can talk a bit about that because again, there are vendors that can remediate these films through chemical processes, but they are quite expensive, and that's when we're getting into grants and additional funding to handle these preservational issues. They're not necessarily things that we can handle on our own. So in this case, these two films came from two different home movie collections that came through TAMI. We could not digitize these. The one on the left was a 16 millimeter black and white film. The one on the right is actually what's called like a mag stripe. It's basically the same premise as like audio cassettes, where this is magnetic tape essentially, but printed on film, and that has audio on it. Luckily, that participant had a film with what's called an optical track on the 16mm film itself. So we, didn't lose much in having to discard the idea of digitizing that mag strip. Another preservational concern that you're going to find is the crystallization of chemical additives in the film. This often gets mistaken for mold, but the best way that you can tell if it's crystallization is actually placing the film up to the light and kind of moving it around. And if you see the film shining back at you, kind of like glitter, then it's actually crystallization. This isn't necessarily something that you can't digitize. And you can certainly try to kind of like clean the film gently with a cotton glove as you handle it. But it's just something to keep in mind of that it's the film telling you that it's in an advanced state of decomposition. And this is definitely a film that you would want to prioritize for digitization. We also have something called film fusion. This is one of my least favorite preservational issues because the film literally becomes fused together like a hockey puck. These films you cannot digitize, period. You cannot unspool them. These need to be given a chemical bath by a professional, and these are ones that you have to send out. This came from a home movie collection. We are, the donor decided ultimately to discard the film, which is unfortunate, but it's understandable because sending a film like this out to a lab for remediation through chemical reprocessing can cost about $2,000 to $3,000 potentially. So it is quite a expensive process. So that's unfortunately kind of one of the things, as you all probably know, that we have to accept in our field, but especially within AV is that, you can only preserve as much as you can. And then even then we have to consider issues like funding and what kind of, resources are available to us. Because something like this is certainly not something, remediation of a film like this is not something that we could do in-house. So that's where kind of setting curatorial priorities comes in as you process audiovisual media and you start thinking about the things that you might have in your collection, is thinking about what items are in advanced states of decomposition, prioritizing those first for digitization so that they don't ultimately escalate into something like this fused film, which will happen. Just kind of coming to terms, unfortunately, that if you do have a fused film or something in a state of brittleness, that you might not be able to digitize that. And if it's unique enough, just thinking about how you might be able to crowdsource or find some sort of funds if it is something that your organization or yourself would like to pursue. So crucial storage conditions. You always want to store things flat. You want to store it in archival housing, aka chemically stable film cans that have ventilation, archival film cores. Molecular sieves are something that you also want to put in a film can with it. Those actually absorb any chemical off-gassing and help slow the deterioration of film. And again, cool, dry place. So ideal temperature is 63 degrees Fahrenheit with ideal humidity at 30%. Of course, we don't all work in temperature and humidity regulated workspaces. So these are all ideals, but I would say the most important thing is storing things flat, storing things in archival cans that have ventilation, because that's one thing I see a lot where people buy archival cans, quote unquote, but they don't have ventilation. And at that point, you might as well have a metal can, because these things, the off-gassing is going to stay trapped. And molecular sieves to absorb any off-gassing. And Kodak sells molecular sieves, so if you just Google Kodak molecular sieves, you can get them there. And then more crucial storage conditions. So again, if nothing else, take your films out of metal cans. This is 16mm mag, so that magnetic audio strip that we were looking at earlier. All of that brown dust is actually the magnetic particles in the film decomposing. These were in a severe state of vinegar syndrome. And the film, or the magnetic audio, was literally falling off of the film into the can because these cans hadn't been opened since the 1980s. So again, cannot stress enough the importance of rehousing things in archival cans. Archival cans can be quite expensive, so even if you have a temporary solution like archivally stable boxes, that's even better because at least those are porous and can absorb some of the off-gassing, especially if they have some sort of ventilation built in. So think about any DIY solutions you might have, because again, there is some sort of cross prohibitive aspect to it. But another vendor that a vendor I'd like to recommend is Urbanski. Urbanski Film. He's based out of Illinois, and he has the best prices for archival material. So if you can, if something like Gaylord or Christie's or university products is too expensive, definitely look into Urbanski, and you can find some pretty affordable archival storage solutions there. Also, another thing I'd like to stress is avoiding quote unquote DIY film preservation solutions that you might find, especially out in the world of film forums where people are saying to put WD-40 film on films, baby oil. I have seen it all as a digitization technician. I have seen it all even at TAMI. We've gotten films with WD-40 on them. And again, it just comes from the fact that our field is so new. Historically speaking, there's such a lack of kind of standardized knowledge out there and best practices that 10, 20 years ago, people were on forums and sharing what they thought were the best preservation solutions for film. And sometimes they were telling each other to put WD-40 on them to lubricate them so that they wouldn't vinegar. Sometimes they were telling each other to put baby oil to lubricate the films to avoid brittleness. Unfortunately, this creates a disaster down the line. We've had films where the minute that you touch them, the emulsion, so AKA the emulsion is what carries the image. So the emulsion or the image immediately wiped off of the film because the WD-40 degraded any sort of, any chemical compounds that were on that film that created the image. So we went from having a film to just having a blank, clear piece of polyester film. So definitely do not attempt to do any of these, and do not do them, period, on any of your films. Now we'll get into video preservation. So videotape emerges in 1956 as these like 1, 2, or 3 inch open reels. They were primarily used for broadcast. You can see on the right hand side, in addition to broadcast, they were used to film like television shows and commercials, but basically for anything that was going to be broadcast, whether that's news, TV, etc. And this is like a short clip that shows you exactly how these reels work. This is from 1968. And you can see they're in an editing room watching a live sports broadcast, and the editor is going to go ahead and do some playback and actually edit this this film in real time. And so this is essentially what what the earliest video was like. When you think of VHS tapes and how it has 2 reels, a supply and take up, we're looking at the same thing, but with these open reels. So if you encounter those in your collection, that's what you're working with, likely some sports or news or commercial, something to that effect. In the 1970s, we start seeing some of the earliest iterations of VHS and Betamax, not necessarily the final versions, but we start looking at something like, for example, U-matic, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. It's an older broadcast tape-based format. It was the oldest cartridge-based tape format. We start getting into what we recognize today, which is consumer video formats like mini DV, 8mm, and then later things like mini DV, which there were mini DV camera or DVD cameras. So some of the preservational concerns that you're commonly going to see here are things like sticky shed syndrome, which is where the tape is actually falling apart in the deck, and you can see that on the right-hand side. The magnetic particles are falling off. Broken tape, which can actually be fixed, so don't be scared if you get a tape that is broken. That's actually one of the easiest things that you can fix, and you can find tutorials on YouTube on how to do that. Deteriorated cartridges, so that can be like a broken VHS cartridge. It can be something where there's something called like padding inside of the VHS cartridge, or a pneumatic cartridge, that can actually get really sticky over time, and you can do like a cartridge replacement, and that's something that you can find a tutorial on YouTube to do. I love video because it's a lot more forgiving, and there's a lot more access on the internet that's like or accurate information on the internet that's accessible, that can help guide you with video, whereas film is kind of hit or miss. But video, it's a pretty solid one. So sticky shed syndrome, if you're playing something back in a deck and it looks like it has all of this snow, go ahead and immediately turn that off. Sticky shed syndrome is one of the most common, if not the most common issues you're going to see with video playback. So if you see something like this, turn it off. That means that you need to bake that tape. There's a few different ways to do this. You can buy a lab grade oven, you can buy a food dehydrator, or in some cases, you'll see tutorials on YouTube where they even bake them in their home ovens. There's a lot of different ways to do this. But you know, just one of the most common things, if you get scared, you see this, don't worry, there are remediation steps you can take. So this is an example of our baking setup. We do have a laboratory grade baker. If you are gonna bake things, this is standard across any type of baker you use, whether it's a commercial food dehydrator, or sorry, a consumer food dehydrator, or your home oven even, which again, just be aware of fire hazards. Don't let anything go unsupervised if you're not using a scientific grade oven with a fail-safe. You do want to monitor that baking at all times. But you would bake it for 125 degrees for 48 hours, let it sit after it's done baking, and then you want to transfer it immediately. This is a general guideline. We have some tapes in our collection that we need to bake for 5 days at 145 degrees because they're in such an advanced state of sticky shed syndrome. And basically what that means is that they are suffering from something called hydrolysis, where there's moisture in the tape pack, and we literally have to bake that all out. So this is the general guideline, but you might find in your work that you need to bake it for longer at a higher temperature, and that's totally fine. And the other thing I want to stress is to clean your decks. If ever you're transferring something that has sticky shed, or even if you're just transferring footage, from time to time, periodically clean them. This is a manual cleaning I had to do of a 1-inch tape machine that we have, but if you have a VHS tape deck, buy VHS tape cleaning tapes. Same with mini DV, buy your cleaning tapes. For any deck that you have in-house, always make sure you have a cleaning tape, because a lot of the time people think that their decks are broken. And sometimes you just need to clean that deck maybe once or twice, and then you're going to have image again. So just something to keep in mind. Again, storage conditions, store them upright in a cool, dry place, ideal temp 73, ideal humidity 20. Again, we can't always temperature control things, but those are just general guidelines. But always make sure, if nothing else, that you're storing things upright. And then later on, we see optical discs emerge in the 1990s. And that eventually leads to DVDs and Blu-rays. And as far as optical disc and digital files, they do have a pretty short lifespan. And I know that this is probably a very, very conservative estimate, but they do say for optical discs, it can be 2 to 5 years. This is just, again, very conservative. We're looking at the possibility of discs not being stored in cases, or being stored in bad conditions, being stored in heat. So you can see a deterioration as soon as that. But again, if you have discs that are 15 years old, and they've been in good condition, you're likely going to be able to play those back. But I like to just kind of be on the conservative end. It's a good reminder of the limited lifespan that this media has. Storage conditions, kind of similar to video, so in the 70s and 50%. With optical disc and digital files, they do vary dramatically in terms of their storage needs from film and video. So you want to avoid extreme cold with these. So you're not going to put a DVD in a cold vault because that will actually damage it. You want to avoid prolonged light exposure, and magnetic fields, which might sound like a weird one, but magnetic fields can affect, hard drives. They can affect DVDs. So just something to keep in mind. And this is the server that we have there at TAMI on the right. We have up to 400 terabytes of storage right now. And even then, that is filling up. If you're interested in digital file management, and your organization is struggling with that, the one thing I can recommend is if you have AVI files, transcode those to MP4. AVI is a huge uncompressed, but now obsolete video format. And if you transcode those to MP4, you can save a lot of space. Another thing is, if you have ProRes files, I always recommend to people looking at the ProRes white paper, because you might not actually need ProRes 422 files. You might be able to get away with 422 or 422, or I'm sorry, 422 LT or 422 proxy. And, I didn't want to get too in the weeds of digital file storage today, but we can chat if you have questions after this and I can get into it. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent from storage and from preservation. But yeah, so as far as storage for optical discs and digital files, for optical discs, the best way to digitize these and to preserve your files is to copy the files literally onto your computer. So getting a DVD drive or a disk drive and just dragging and dropping those files onto your computer, onto whatever storage or digital repository you have. With DVD files from DVD, you could buy something like UniConverter to transcode those over into like a playable MP4, because if you've ever attempted to copy files from a DVD on your computer, they're probably in a really weird format where it splits it into audio and video folders, and there's things called VOB files, and it's very confusing. If you buy something like UniConverter, it's about $100, I think, for a perpetual license. And this could even be an intern project to just get them to go ahead and copy files and transcode them to MP4 and kind of preserve any backlog of DVDs that you might have in your collection. And moving on to digital files, we have the rule of 3. You probably already know this, but you want to store the files ideally in 3 locations. Again, since we are putting a lot of stake in a digital facsimile, if we don't have the physical item anymore in particular, or if the physical item is like a videotape that we digitize and we know it's going to degrade with time and might not be playable another 10 years, make sure that you're storing the file in its original source location, whether that's in a local repository or your server. A secondary source, so that could be a server with redundancy, which we always recommend in case a partition goes down. There is a backup that has saved a copy of it. And then a third source, such as a cloud-based solution. You can look at multiple different vendors, whether it's Amazon or Dropbox, etc. And we just always recommend having something stored there, because they have backup on LTO tape, which I won't get too much into, but basically they have a lot of fail safes in place. If worst case scenario, you have a fire and everything goes down, you lose the server, you lose your local computers. If you have something on a cloud, you can at least have some assurance that you'll have your files accessible in perpetuity. So again, we're on cloud storage. If you do decide to go to something like Amazon Web Services, for example, just as one example, they might have nonprofit and institutional pricing. So always want to shop around and see what's available to you. And I always recommend getting a sales rep for any vendor that you work with, so that they can actually give you a best sense of what is available, and give you a better deal than maybe if you were just to attempt it on your own. And that just comes from my own background, having worked in like film boutiques and things like that. Like, always work with a sales rep. You're going to get a better deal than if you attempt it on your own. The nice thing too is that if you have something like glacier storage, which is where you just have a backup copy that's not necessarily accessible without putting in like a customer service request, which seems cumbersome, but it is extremely affordable. It can cost a fraction of a cent. So just something to think about there as far as the advantages of cloud storage, and how they can actually be pretty cost effective. You know, because storage can be pricey, especially if you're doing it on a local RAID partition. And what should you do when you find media? So a couple of things. I always recommend first doing a preservation assessment where you identify the format, identify the item's condition, log data, and develop a preservation plan. Logging data is probably one of the most important things, because you want to document any conservation concerns that you have. And conservation concerns should include the item's age, condition, obvious afflictions, and any previous storage conditions, because this leads directly into your preservation plan. The way I think of a preservation plan is I almost think of it as like a curatorial priority, is that once you have all of that data of everything that you're working with, and again, it doesn't have to be super granular. If you're working with a ton of stuff, if you know the more product, less process approach, you can do a high level overview. If you have like, you know, 50 boxes worth of media, just kind of going box by box rather than item by item if you are a smaller organization, limited for time, just to kind of get a sense. Because if you have one box that obviously smells like vinegar, you're going to want to prioritize the preservation of that box. So think of it in that way. It's a curatorial priority in terms of what you're going to digitize, or what you have limited funding, even for archival rehousing, what you're going to rehouse first, what seems like it's more stable housing. Because sometimes these preservation plans that you develop, they might require several years to actually fully realize, when we're looking at things like funding, for example. So kind of being realistic and not panicking, but being realistic with the resources that are available to you, and kind of working from there, and you know, establishing what the highest priority needs are. And we can talk more about that if you have questions at the end. And so for long-term planning, once you've done your media preservation assessment, you're going to want to think about the actual preservation itself. And again, that goes into, are you going to try to rehabilitate films? Are you going to try to digitize films? Are you going to try to rehouse them? Are you just going to take them out of the metal cans, and put them in, even if you have archival quality storage boxes? Thinking about those things. As far as storage, are you going to relocate and relocate the media to any particular area based on environmental conditions? Or are you going to separate anything based off of vinegar syndrome? If you're planning to digitize, you might need to investigate copyright as well. You might also want to form partnerships, and connect with stakeholders. So if you have media that's specific to an organization or a filmmaker or a community, you might want to look at community organizations, or if it's for a particular city, their chamber of commerce, if they have an arts office. Just being really resourceful and seeing if there's anyone you can partner with that might want to help pay for the archival rehousing or for the digitization. If it's even like, for example, if you work at a university and there's a professor that focuses on a subject area that you have archival materials for, do they want to partner up on some sort of preservation project, and what connections might they have to potential funding or crowdsourcing? So thinking about things in that way, because again, our field, unfortunately, AV archives being so new, and our historical timeline aren't really right now given the proper attention in terms of funding and buy-in from like donors and boards and things like that, that, you know, maybe things that have more obvious historical value at this current point in time, like paper materials, you know, old Italian folios, a Gutenberg Bible, you know, more of an easy sell. So you might just need to kind of look at more on the ground solutions to crowdsource things and crowdsource your preservation projects. Another thing I want to stress is that YouTube is your friend. So I mentioned this a bit. But a lot of DIY solutions can be found there. Again, you want to be careful of what you're finding. But for the most part, I would say with video stuff, it's always a safe bet, like basic things, how to do tape repairs, how to diagnose and repair a broken deck. I would only recommend repairing a broken deck if you kind of feel comfortable doing something like that. But a lot of the times these professional broadcast decks like Tune-matic, for example, are going to give you error codes. So YouTube is your friend there. Also, if you're going to do any DIY baking, definitely recommend looking there for any help. If you're looking at, to educate yourself on like video files, the history of video, resolutions, I can't recommend it enough. And again, a part of that is because our field is very new. And so part of being a media archivist at this point in time historically is just being very resourceful in your ability to locate knowledge. There's not standardized practices for our field. A lot of universities don't offer a huge breadth of courses that educate LIS students on how to do proper media archiving and all of the different steps and components, just due to the lack of funding and buy-in and understanding at the larger institutional levels. So definitely recommend being resourceful. Don't be afraid to get in there and just kind of try to identify as much information as you can on your quest. And also looking at the Association of Moving Image Archivists listserv. They have a very active listserv where you can ask questions. You'll see people asking questions. They also have a resources page that's really in depth and can really give you a really good idea of how to particularly assess and preserve film. So definitely look at the AMIA website. Another thing that I do a lot and might be of interest to you all is looking at this website that's partially run by the Internet Archive called Lantern Media History. So that's lantern.mediahist.org. And what I do sometimes, if there is a weird format, whether it's film or video or an issue that I'm encountering, they have an extensive media history library where it's just all like journals that have been digitized from like professional industry journals. So you can find old projectionist journals from like the 1930s that talk about film preservation issues. You can find video and filmmaking journals from the 80s. For example, if I look up sticky shed syndrome, it's giving me an article from the Moving Image Review, because again, there's not standardized knowledge in our field. And a lot of the time you just kind of have to look at old industry journals to see what was going on when these were prominent issues for the filmmakers themselves or the broadcasters themselves. And it gives you a lot of insight into what you're dealing with and how to deal with that particular issue. So for example, I was recently finding a lot of films that had what are called humidifiers in the can. If you ever find a can like this, it has like a little mesh piece in the circle, like a circular mesh piece with like a little piece of paper, and it says to put camphor oil on it. I couldn't find any information online except for in these journals about, basically what the process was that people would preserve their home movies with camphor oil and all of the weird issues that come with that. So anyway, there's a lot of really niche and esoteric knowledge in here that you can't find online more accessibly. So definitely recommend this website. In terms of how TAMI could help, if you're ever interested, we do have something called the Film Roundup that we open up twice a year. It just closed for October, but our next one will be in March, and you can submit up to 20 videos or up to 3,500 feet of film for free digitization through our grant that we get from the Texas Film Commission. And it is open to organizations, institutions, educational organizations. There's basically no limit. You can submit as an individual. We don't only do home movies, we've done industrial films, government films, etc. So just something to think about. If you would like some free digitization, if you have stuff sitting in your vault, we have the capacity to digitize that for you and do preservation assessments and do everything in-house. So just something to think about if you're in Texas. And then as far as staying in touch, we do have an Instagram. I have an Instagram. There's also my email if you would like to contact me. I'm a bit slow on email, but I will respond, I promise.